This is our fifth session. We are going to continue a little bit on what the modern state, the modern form and element of it. We left off, kind of broke off last week on the character of. Okay, hold on. Go back up here. Speak, nice boy. We talked about the origins of the Middle Europe. The origins of what we consider European political development. European political development is interesting because we could make an argument that it is the first post-colonial. It is, and we can say, this is the thing is we have a whole thing of literature today. We're talking about post-colonialism, that there's we talk about the after impact of a colonizational process and the political, the attempt of either returning the breakdown of the colonial process or the post-colonial process and developing political life. Now, this is often assumed always to be post-colonial from the point of view of Europe's interference in the Third World. But to be honest, or even the Americas, right? The role of Spanish and Portuguese colonization in South America, and French, Dutch, and English colonization within North America, most of European influence in Africa and Asia, right? But to be honest with you, this is kind of like it ignores the fact that, I'm sorry, there's been more than one colonization and recolonization in human history. Human history is, by the way, people conquering other people or taking over other people's territory is not the exception, it's the norm in the evolution of human history. Human beings organized in tribal groups. Often, if they didn't have enough strength, they would flee. Fight or flee, right? Fight or flee. If they had enough strength to defeat their enemy, and they thought they did, or if they thought they did, they would struggle for it. They would fight. They would fight for resources. Usually, they fled from each other, and this explains why human migration occurred as it did. In other words, that human existence began in Africa. We know it began around the plains of the Serengeti and that Central Africa, and that. But over time, the human beings and human groups spread out all through the continent. We assume that there's probably was some continental drift. We're looking at 50,000, 60,000 years ago. We're looking even maybe earlier sometimes, maybe some. We think most of humanity emerged at the same point of time. In other words, genetically, we know that everyone emerged at there, but then as the population shifted over time, there was a specific, if you know how genetics or an organism adapts to environment, will lead to the adapting of towards environment will lead to differentiation of certain genetic traits. So therefore, we know this from viruses by and species subspeciation. So we also know this in terms of human beings, how human beings have merged to different locations. They adapted to those locations, and their adaptations through survival. In other words, the children, reproductive success of the children, people who survived them, would then pass those genetic traits that were adaptive to those environments. Okay. So we know that there was this idea, but still, even within, remember, we're looking at hunter-gatherers, and hunter-gatherers usually followed their food. Okay, they either gathered and they went to locations that would produce food, land that produced food, or they gathered. We only around 30,000 BC, 20,000. We noticed that they started, the using of dogs for hunting. We know that they started to breed animals for food. So around between 20, 30,000 Okay, so we know that there's certain developments that occurred from. We know that from hunter-gatherers they emerged the next nomadic. In other words, people who instead of just merely hunting, they started breeding their animals, like the food that they ate, and they still roamed the places to get food for their herds. Okay, these are the nomadic people in that sense. They usually produce certain things, and by the way, this is also when we know that humans started using milk, drinking milk at the same time. That particularly people who went from Africa into the what we consider the middle North Africa and the Middle East. Why into that area? Because we know the difference between people who have lactose intolerance versus not. The African populations have high levels of are not able to process milk at high levels. And therefore, one of the things that developed for why people did it was like that. So we have this whole history of human beings moving into new areas and taking it over, and that one tribe taking over the territory of another tribe. We know that this happened in the Baltic peoples. We know that as the Slavic peoples came into this region, they exterminated the initial Baltic peoples. This is all of human. One tribe will exterminate the other tribe in order to ensure that it survives. In other words, every group will seek its own survival and will not sacrifice its survival for the sake of another's group. Okay, so that is the norm in that sense. This is what is typical behavior of all humanoid life species in that sense. So as we develop into what we understand European, therefore we look at political development and we look at the way that certain things have developed. We will see certain patterns, and one of the big patterns was the development of, as we talked about the birth of the polis and the birth of the thing in around 5th century BC, the rise of free cities, the cities and those dominant structures. And what happened was, after a certain amount of time, it rise around about middle of the 4th century, beginning to middle 4th century BC. What happened was the rise of Phillip of Macedon and what we call the reestablishment of hegemonic leagues. Okay, even within the 5th, 6th century Greece, the free cities still tended to have alliances and political groupings of domination over other cities. Okay, but it was framed via the framework. The framework was no longer merely imperial rule, but rather through the rule of political rule. The city, in other words, the political form of the city, civic orders, civic structures that tended one city dominating another city, or either through trade or coercion, or military alliance, or interdependence for military alliance. Okay, or in other words, and that defined the Mediterranean until the rise of first Phillip of Macedon, who what happened? He basically took a tribal people. He brought to a tribal society, the Macedonians, who were basically a series of multiple little tribes of northern Thrace and up there, and he brought to them the habits and structures of the Greek cities, the civic life. Not the civic life, but some of the institutions of the soldiery, the things, and took alliances and knowledge that he gained at his time in Thebes and gave it to the Macedonian tribal leaders. And being unifying all the tribes, he then conquers Greece. Now, what he does is the Macedonian model of this is different from, let's say, the Persian model, or even the other Aztecs, Incas, and all those. You see, in other words, this empire is modified by a civic form. In other words, we see evolution of how people rule each other. Okay? In other words, tribes and empires produced the polis. The conflict of tribe and empires produced the polis, the Greek civic order, right? The civic order kind of hits its limit of how it can organize around the 4th century BC. What replaces it is a hybrid of an empire with using the elements of the civic order, okay? And this also will explain Rome, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire will be a civic order who then conquers other cities, other tribes, other nations, peoples, and then rules it hegemonically. We rules those people hegemonically, but while ruling itself politically. And that but then what happens then is the hegemonic rule itself of the larger system ultimately breaks down the political rule. In other words, the hegemonic rule over the other population ultimately undermined that. But what the empire did was it settled its political form all over Western Europe. Okay? And why is that important? Because this will help you understand the European structure is colonialized. Western. The difference between Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, versus Western Europe is Roman colonization. And the impact of the Roman Empire, both in its final form. The final form of the Roman Empire, not final, it's semi-final. The final form of the Roman Empire in the West is the Roman Empire of the 4th, 5th, 6th century AD. Around 5th and 6th century AD, this is when Germanic populations in the center areas, the non-conquered German peoples, were because of something in Asia, something happened in the Caucasus that drove basically what is it? It's a series of invasions of other. One of the invasions was the invasion of China at the same time, right, by the Huns. We know that the Mongol populations of what we call those areas. Today they're completely different. Islam changed them dramatically. Two things changed them. Their conquering of China changed them, but also their Islam changed them dramatically. Why? Because before that they were the huge conquerors. They put pressure, their mobilization and their things drove populations that were in what we call those areas into the Germanic regions, and then pushed the Germanics to go. In other words, it was as population groups and population shifted because of the roving attacks of the Mongols. Peoples from the steppes and people that went, in fact, even the Slavic people went what? It went westward. The original Slavic peoples. And what that mean is that it put the Germans decided to take advantage of a weak empire in the West. Now, we talked about this as that what is the empire? If we look at the Middle Ages starting around, let's say, 6th century, really 7th century to 15th century, is about what we consider the Middle Ages, and that 16th, the Renaissance is like 16th, 16th century, 17th, 16th century, a little bit 15th century, early parts of the 15th century, 16th century, right? This is what we consider the Renaissance moment, which was kind of a kind of miniature recovery of ancient knowledge, right? The classic, the science and knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans, as well as innovation of new scientific thinking. But to understand the European political development of feudalism is to understand it in terms of basically a collapse of an imperial system a utter collapse of an imperial system, the reestablishment of tribal rules, and it's basically it's basically the Holocaust. I mean, the apocalypse happened, and everyone just prepped, Okay, basically civilization as they knew it ended because of the attacks of the barbarians and the collapse of the system. There was many reasons why it collapsed. One, as I talked about, is that the Roman elites no longer wanted to maintain the empires. They didn't want to serve. The barbarians, the Germanic and other barbarians, tended to become the leadership of the regional parts of the empire in the west. Therefore, there was a kind of situation where there was little real loyalty to the imperial capital. And remember, the imperial capital moved from Rome to what is called today Constantinople or Istanbul, right? And therefore, the logistics of empire and managing empire was very difficult. So when all of a sudden the huge waves of migration from the Germanics and Arabs, and then remember at the same time in the 6th century A.D., Muhammad happens, and within 100 years, all of North Africa, which was the Roman Empire's Christian, in other words, the Christian Roman Empire, that was the big center of North Africa, was basically a vibrant part of Christianity. Alexandria was a leading center of intellectual life, culture of this Christianized Roman Empire, right? Remember, the Bishop of Alexandria is one of the key. The Patriarch from Alexandria is one of the 5 key leading members of the Christian Church under the emperor. Okay. So if you understand the structure of what happened, we see a collapsing of European development is an utter collapse, and then what happens out of the ruins survive multiple remnants of political structures or new structures that try to restructure things politically and in place of the empire emerge. We talked about it like this: the households and the estates, right? How the households, in other words, one of the mechanisms were the surviving households and estates. The people who, in other words, people who owned, basically lords or people who remember, civic life in the empire, the elites. If you know how farms worked in the time of this, by 2nd century BC, small-scale farming ceased to exist. It was all commercial farms controlled by rich oligarchs and farming was done by slaves. And the slaves were not merely the slaves that they captured from Greece and Rome, they were also the slaves that they conquered in Europe. Most of the slaves were European in that sense. Populations. Most of the Germanic population was in the northern areas under Roman control was enslaved. Only very few German leaders or Germans were made. Usually they were people who swore loyalty to the emperor and worked as soldiers and who got benefited from it. In other words, maybe they even started as slaves, because they even allowed, around the time of Marcus Aurelius, they allowed slaves to become soldiers. And this fundamentally altered the character of imperial life in Rome in that sense. It actually led to a kind of complete unwillingness of the Roman elite, the Italian Roman elite, to wish to participate in the system. And therefore, what ended up happening was actually even greater, what we call disconnection in the structure of political command and control. So when the barbaric raids hit, in all three, in 3 ways. Remember, it was first you had the Huns coming in and going into the Adriatic, near the Adriatic, cutting off Rome, Italy to Greece. You had the rise of North Africa, the complete capture of North Africa, and much of the southern part of that. the rise of piracy, the collapsing of the sea, control of the sea, and the Mediterranean became a hotbed of pirates again, because that was always the problem. If you know anything about even the Greek history, the Greek and Roman history, piracy was one of the biggest problems of the Mediterranean. And that one of the successes of the Romans was the extermination of piracy on the Mediterranean. And that's how Pompeii became famous, for destroying the pirate bases and exterminating the pirates and establishing total Roman control of the seas. That, by the 6th century AD, that's gone. The seas are no longer safe. And the Romans themselves were never really good at sea anyways. These were the people. These were the Gallic people of the city of Marseille. These were the commercial. The Corinthians and the Marseillians are the two we call the two people who were sea-bearing merchants for the Romans. The Romans will exterminate and shut down Corinth when it rebels around 2nd century BC. So only the Marseillaise did that. Marseillaise will kind of break down. Marseillaise will lose control. In other words, the Romans, the slaves take over Marseillaise. The Greek slaves and Hebrew slaves will take over the trade at Marseillaise around 2nd century AD. Around 2nd century AD, the slaves are running this empire for the most part. Greek and Roman slaves. And they do so because both the Greeks and the Romans know something. They know about, it's a little trick. Have you ever tried doing math or any kind of accounting in Roman numerals? Bookkeeping with Roman numerals? What do the Roman numerals lack? 0. It's the Arabs, the Persian and Arab world. The number system we have now is Arabic. Who knew the Arabic symbols, Persian Arabic numbers? Well, the slaves, first of all, the Jews were captured by the Persians for these 500 years, enslaved by them. They knew it. They knew Persian numbering. The Greeks conquered the Persians. They knew it. And the Greek merchant traders and the Jews both became powerful commercial people because they used Arabic numeric models to do accounting. And that made doing accounting easier. Bookkeeping. And if you know anything about empire or political control, it's all about money and budgeting. If you can't budget, in other words, budgeting, my God, just try looking at numbers in ancient Greek, and you can understand why their economy was so simple. It's really difficult to look at Greek numbers in that sense. Of course, it's interesting. Greek numbers their numeric system allows for advanced mathematics, but not calculative mathematics. It's pretty good for geometry, Euclid, but it's not necessarily good for simple calculation and advanced calculations. It's very complex. Roman is slightly better, but it's still not easy. It's very, just do totals. Just try to do totals and see how this works. Arabic system is very simple and good. So therefore, what you have is a situation of moments of development. The Roman Empire had its peak both politically, but also the way it fell apart also led to the shaping of how Europe will develop, Western Europe will develop. And we can tell the difference between Western versus Central and Eastern Europe. What's the difference between Eastern and Western Europe? One is Latin, one is conquered by the Russians were conquered by whom? Who conquered most of the Slavic peoples? Mongols. And therefore they shaped Their culture was a despotic culture of a master. It was basically a tribal ruler of tribal mastery, of the tribal leader controlling that, and everything was portable. In other words, they demanded loyalty and fee payments to that. So what did the Russian rulers behave like? They behaved like the Mongol leader. They did not develop a civic political identity. They did not have the Roman. They will get the Roman experience only through European contact. Poland is weird because Poland gets it because of what? The Western Catholic, the Catholic Church, his missionaries. Two reasons. I mean, who was the biggest missionaries here? Who were the biggest missionaries that Christianized this? No, before that.
Syria and Methodic?
No. That's Pan-Slavonic. No, that it wasn't. You weren't really Christianized that much by Pan-Slavism. You got some of it, but it wasn't the thing. What really made this part of the world Christian? The Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights were a religious order, a monastic military order that Christianized here by the sword.
Well, but the Poland was already Christianized before the Teutons came.
No, you have to remember this. There were many different waves. The last wave, Polish history talks about the last wave of the Teutonic Knights, where they established their principal orders here. But they were different orders of the different Germanic orders, because the Teutonic Knights are the biggest and most organized one. What happened was corporate merger. The Teutonic Knights merged together all the other various smaller bands and united them under the authority of one head captain general. Okay? So therefore the Germanic conquest and Christianization here. There was Christianization, yes, there was a previous Christianization, but the leaders didn't Christianize. The leaders only Christianized only in response to the threats of these German threats, their rule, their power. They adopted Christianity as a way to saying, well, you can't. Okay, if you're a Christian, could the Teutonic Knight invade you if you're Christian? No. They were able to loot, rob, and take everything you had if you weren't Christian. So therefore, this created a concept of Christian. Why certain why certain Slavic populations immediately Christianized?
Once again, please.
This explains why certain political leaders Christianized. The ones who Christianized survived. Those who refused to Christianize died out and was exterminated by the Teutonic Order. Hence the Prus. The real Prussia, the old Prus, were basically Baltic populations that were basically, that the Germanics basically took over and interbred and became modern Prussia, the origins of Prussia. Okay? So therefore we have to understand the surviving institutions. We talked about this last week. Now, why is this important? Well, we have to understand the development of state structures in light of this, because this is the whole point. Do I get this right? Okay, no, that's last week. Okay, now I'll go to this week. It's going to be a grumpy. Shoot that away. This goes us to the Bobbitt reading, because we have to understand why did the state is a product of Renaissance rethinking of the problem of politics. The Renaissance world looks at this chaos of the Middle Ages. What is this? The Middle Ages has a plurality of possible political forms. There is the desire to reestablish empire, right? The Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, right? We get with Charlemagne, right? Which is what? It was the Frankish monarch, the Frankish kings attempt to unify rule under them, using the church's knowledge about the Roman Empire's past, taking a dormant claim of emperorship that existed legally. In other words, it used the Holy Roman Empire is the Frankish monarchies attempt of a dynastic order from Pippin attempted to use Roman imperial legal facts and the church's role as the surviving Roman institution, imperial institution, to legitimize that fact to the claimant, his son's claimant, right? In other words, to understand what happened in the Middle Ages, it was the survivors and the ambitious rulers, the people who wanted to establish political rule, used the remaining imperial forms and tools left behind. So you had the old civic forms, so small cities that had independence or some kind of autonomy to themselves reestablished civic forms, the cities. Particularly you see the revival of the cities around the 8th century, 9th century, usually because of commerce and trade. We see the cities in the south, in northern Italy, right? The rise of the free cities of commerce and trade through commerce. We also know the Hanseatic cities, that the combination of the Danes and Vikings set up trading cities all through northern Europe. We have to remember around the 6th century, one of the big groups that was the Vikings. The role of the Vikings here cannot be underestimated. They were what? They fled their area because of there was not enough farmland. And primogeniture and single ownership made it difficult for surviving kin groups to just do it. So therefore they fled. They basically were traders. The longboats were trading boats that went through the rivers very quickly. They used rivers and to navigate that. They could navigate the North Sea, not the North Sea well, but they navigated the North Sea somewhat well. They're deep shaft boats. The longboats were so deep that they could carry lots of cargo, and they did. And they also got involved in trade, and also what they did is that if they found, how can I say? You have to understand, one of the mechanisms of trade was piracy. Taking things, theft. And one of the goods that was useful in trade, because as you go to Constantinople and also to later into the Persians, not Persia, but Constantinople and then later the Muslim world, what happens? Slaves. Europeans as slaves. So what you see here is a very important dynamic of commerce and trade that then leads what? To the rise of these Hanseatic cities. So you have these Hanseatic cities, you have the return of the Roman cities, because growing commerce and trade among the households on larger scale reestablish urban commercial life. This creates a system of networks and situation that revives the city form. So you have therefore you have a series of competing forms. And also remember you have therefore a series of competing authorities. The church being another one. The church itself became the sole surviving imperial authority in the West. And a lot of the claims that various political leaders will make will rely on the church to legitimize them. So the church itself saw itself as a competing zone of authority. And therefore the feudal structure of these interconnected jurisdictional structures, it leads to the rise of legalist constructions. In other words, legal law becomes the mechanism to describe jurisdictional authority. This is the Middle Ages is a world of jurisdictional political rule, where there's jurisdictions and there's rules and there's competing claims of authority. There's the two spheres: the crown, the political ruler, the secular ruler, and the spiritual, the church. And the church's claim was as much temporal as it was spiritual. The church was a huge owner of capital and assets. They owned lots of land. And that land, and the use of that land, through their manipulation of use, sale, and production of the land and resources gave them wealth. And that wealth gave them power. And this is the origins of the development. So European political development comes out of a structure of a post-colonial Roman imperial forms and the surviving political forms that now we can say the same thing happens. You want to study Africa? I can tell you what happened in Africa. All African systems are surviving of the post. It takes the political and legal forms that the colonizer gave them was then adapted by the various tribal structures coming into it. And what happens in post-Africa? They never created a people. They never formed a civic. The populations remained tribal. This is the Arab world, much of East Asia, the same thing of this. Unless the population formed a civic identity, a common civic identity, everything remained at a tribal level. And what happened was once the imperial power left, but left the form and memory of the forms and institutions, what happened? Tribal, like what happened in the Middle Ages. A tribal leader seized control over the surviving forms and utilized it to advance their tribal claim. No difference. So therefore, we have to understand the development of this. Now, what is important is how does the nation develop? Because it's very important to understand how the nation state, or the state itself, becomes the rise of the modern state becomes the mechanism to exclude the other claims. The state becomes the only legitimate claimant of political power. All the others have to frame it in the concept. They have to be states. The cities are no longer cities. They have to be also states. Hence the term city-states. This emerges around the 15th, 16th century, the city-states. They adopt the state form. They adopt the city as they conform the city as a state. Now we know what's important about this. It's with the Treaty of Westphalia, with the establishment of the Treaty of Westphalia, ending the 30-Year War. What does it do? It requires that only states are legitimate actors in the world. No other actor can act on the world stage towards other things. You have to be a state. But the thing what they'll do is they'll say, well, no, we'll call you states. This is why the papal states, the church, becomes the papal states. Therefore, they're not recognized as the church. The Vatican and the church is not recognized as a separate authority, but rather merely one state among many. Westphalia does, this is why Bobbitt's work will be very important, because Bobbitt explains how treaties, conflict between states, will produce the mechanism that will shape the evolution of states. For the emergence of the princely state. Now, this is the strategy. Bobbitt talks about, in the reading of Bobbitt, is this history of the constitutional development of the state. Now, it will develop in a certain way. He says, he gives here, his concept is basically, it's sixfold. The princely state, the kingly state, the territorial state, the state-nation and the nation state. Then finally, what he calls, starting in the 1990s and early 2000s in the modern world, the so-called market state. His argument of a market state is actually weak. I think Fukuyama's understanding is better here. It's nation states, regional states, world states. As we explained, remember, the concept of the state is bounded and only limited by consent, the consent of the willing agencies. What prevents larger political forms? Well, how can you form consent? How is consent made? Okay, that's the problem.
By force.
Well, no, it can't be by force. If it's by force, it's no longer political. It's no longer consent.
But you can force people to.
No, you can't. They're not. They won't. That has to be what legitimates the social contract to form the political bond is legitimate. In other words, it cannot be by force. They have to want it, because if it's by force, the second they don't feel the force, what's going to happen?
They will rebel.
Exactly. The system only works when the parties want to be a member of it. If they're held together by coercion, the system will immediately collapse once the force is no longer there. In other words, it's a concept of that they will it to be so. Now, you could turn everyone into slaves, and that you can so pervert their character that they will submit and no longer have that. But that is going to be, I'm sorry, eventually someone, even after a certain time, statistically what will happen, enough of people will arise that will not want to be it, and therefore they will rebel, and you can never just maintain it by force. Once the force is lost, or the perception of force is lost, the people who want to be free and don't accept the authority of the thing will rebel and overthrow it. And if it's weak, it will be immediately overthrown. And if it's despised, it's even there'll be even more reason to destroy it. Okay? So we have to understand that the legitimization of structure here is framed within the context of the idea of state. The state is a conceptual, willed entity where consent is there. Therefore, what is the biggest limitation? It's the ability of consent is not force. It's getting people to agree. And how will they agree? Well, first of all, if they don't see, they have to basically see either benefit, utility interests, right? They have to have shared interests, they have to share something strong enough that sees them as us, not them. Okay? They have to create an us rather than them. Us versus them. If you see them as a them, then they are not us. So what divides us? Will divide us from them? Well, accidental things. Language. First of all, to be able to form a contract where everyone agrees to this, it's going to be difficult. Now, you can negotiate things without understanding people, but it's not going to create deep bonds. You can create shallow agreements without complete understanding. But to have one where you see them as us, you have to have complete, total comprehension of each other. You understand? This is how this works? So language will be a bond. The perception, if I don't see you as us, visual differentiations. Things that distinguish us from each other. That can be a reason why we don't see each other. Our differences, that visual differences, will lead to perceptions of difference. Okay, there is a problem here. There's going to be the fact that different populations and peoples, through adaptation of the different environments, will have different spatial bone structures, face structures, that therefore people will look at it and you can tell a person, in other words, Different people, different races, different groups have different bone structures, facial structures. You can tell by the bones. You can tell by bones what the person's race is. Facial structures are universal, but they're still forms. We judge each other by human communication is as much non-verbal as verbal. Actually, 70% of all human communication is all done through non-verbal. We read each other's body language. Our body language, I can tell if you're lying. Someone trained in interrogation will know when you're lying by just looking at you and talking to you. Because why? What happens when you lie or you're inventing something?
Your eyes are.
Why?
Your eyes are moving to the left side.
Because that is the imaginative, that is the part of the brain that you create that. And I hate to say it, you know how much training you have to go through to be able to, you have to have so much training and ability that you fight that. Or you're completely sociopathic. Usually sociopaths will always pass lie detectors. And even those kind of tests. Because they're sociopathic. Their characteristic allows them to just lie, and they believe their lie. Therefore, this is the aspect of training and things like this. So therefore, this is how you can read. Our body language is the mechanism that you can even negotiate people you don't speak the same language to. So some levels of negotiation and interaction is possible, but not total interaction. So therefore, there's a limit. Therefore, there's a body linguistic limit. And also, there's a biological limit, physiological, biological limit, because of the perception of difference. Small differences can lead to people not saying, you don't look like me, you don't look like mine, you look different. So you trust yours, you don't trust the other. Learning to trust the other requires trust, right? The building of trust. How does trust emerge? Trust emerges through social interaction and social mutual benefit. Long-term interconnection, long-term experience sharing each other, and long-term positive reinforcement of mutual positive benefaction. Again, read the famous book by Robert Axelrod, The Evolution of Cooperation, to explain how different peoples of different things, through their interactions of mutual benefit, over time will view themselves to the point where their children and their grandchildren will intermarry and form the same population group. Now, the state evolves. Why? He says that this development here, he goes, hold on. Come on, nice computer, come out. I hate this. The trajectory of what Bobbitt argues is that we have this interstate. The thesis is right here. The interplay between strategic and constitutional innovations changed the constitutional order of the state. Again, the interplay between strategic innovation and constitutional, the political structure of the state. Every state will have a constitutional structure, the ordering of the state, the structures of ordering the legal institutions, how those structures are interacted and interconnected. Therefore, the interplay between the changes, how the different changes over time affect each other. In other words, how does strategic changes affect constitutional changes? And how constitutional changes affect strategic changes? One of the most important books in here is Carroll Quigley's Weapon Systems. I forget I always forget the title. Carroll Quigley. Weapon Systems and Political Stability. written in 1980. It was published after he died in 1980. What? It was 1980. No, I don't know. Not now. Go away. It was published in 19. It's not saying. It was published in 1981-83, if I remember correctly. It was by University American Press. And why am I pointing to this book is because his argument is very interesting. It echoes what's his name? To understand the origin of free cities in the Greek cities, it's the rise of hoplite infantry warfare. In other words, the change of organization of warfare by citizen soldiers shaped civic life. Political freedom meant, in the Greek city structure, the armed element is the ruling element. So it is the ruling element that has the means of force to protect and control itself. The classical view is that a free society will always be the element that is armed. And have not just armed, it means military grade arms. In fact, quickly shows that every time there's political stability, the citizenry is heavily armed. When you unarm the citizenry, and it's controlled by specialized power, two things happen. One is that there's less political civic freedom, and two, there's more instability. Because why? Competing leaders will use the divided loyalties of the specialists to seize and maintain control of the system. And now, why is this important? Because this will shape our understanding, starting with even Victor Davis Hanson's The Western Way of War explained that the rise of the free cities is tied to the citizens' army. It is the citizen armies that destroy the Persian Empire. In other words, the free cities are in their citizen armies, and the creation of an armed middle class that has enough resources to heavily arm themselves enough. They're able to preserve and maintain and prevent larger hegemonic rulers from happening. Now, why do the new hegemonic rulers happen? Is because they adopt, the later hegemonic rulers adopt civic structures. The success of the Roman Empire is through its army. It's giving rights to the army. It's when the change and the evolution of change that happened in the second century after the Punic Wars, when Marcius was reformed, which allowed the lowest sixth class, the propertyless citizens, not the slaves, but the propertyless citizens. These people who had only one vote in the system, qualified, in other words, the whole class only got one vote. But they were exempted from taxes and service. In other words, they couldn't serve in the military. All the other citizens are required to serve in the military. The Marcius reforms decided to make armies pay. That the military leader goes conquest something, then they get to keep them. Instead of the money going back to their treasury, the money went to the general to distribute to the soldiers. And they paid the soldiers. Therefore, it permitted what? The lowest classes, who were previously exempted to military service, now became members of the military. And this is this factor destabilized the civic character of Rome. Because why? It's basically the lowest classes who were basically the least property cap. They had least resources. They had almost nothing. They entered the military control, and therefore what happened is they loved war. They loved conquering things. Why? Because by conquering things, they got money. Whereas when the middle class ruled the military and the armed services, the upper half of the lower class and the middle classes, when they were the soldiers, they had stuff. They didn't want to lose it. They wanted to get back to their stuff. So they weren't that aggressive. They would fight a war, and they were good at it, but they did not necessarily want to conquer more because they couldn't get anything from it. It was only after the collapse, after the Second Punic War, when what happened was Hannibal's the fact that they had to abandon all the farmland in the Roman areas and the farmlands, where basically the farming, the mass scale middle class farmers lost everything. And after the war, what happened was rich people bought the land, wealthy merchants bought the land in mass, and what they did was they then serviced the farm, these mass lafundas, through slave labor. And what happened? You had more people. The old traditional middle class now became landless, and therefore the only mechanism of pay was the military branch and conquest. So therefore the situation, the economic class situation and depopulation of the citizenry and the marginalization of the middle class led to the rise of a rapacious mass that was now being used as a soldiery. So therefore in Rome there were three classes now: the wealthy, the poor, and the soldiers. The rich, the few, the wealthy, the many, poor, and the soldiers. Plus you add the slaves, and the slaves became the soldiers eventually. This becomes, much as Machiavelli will say in his discussion of the class war that shapes the later empire. So, what is about this? The big innovation is the princely state. The princely state gives the princely ruler a political form that is better than the older forms. Why? The state gives more centralized political rule. It's a more centralized system of command and control. It's unitary. Now, what happens? This gives the princely, in other words, his form of rule establishes a more unitary controlling structure. So this transition from prince to princely state provides us the initial example of strategic imperative, animating the constitutional innovation, an instance that is where the insistent question of security of a specific context, i.e. geography, wealth of a small population, yields a new legal solution and requires a story to rationalize that situation. Bobbitt argues. Relying on Machiavelli. He's relying on Machiavelli's account of the prince utilizing this to some situation to secure his thing and creating a story, a rationalization. And it's a new legal form, constitutional form, the state, unitary structure. Now, what happens here is that we then move from what the princely state establishes, right? The princely state. This princely state is a situation where a ruler is utilizing the state. Now, what happens? What is the shift between princely state and kingly state? Dynasty. Dynastic rule. Son replacing father. In other words, the succession, that there is a orderly, familiar succession to rule and control of the state. The next state is the territorial state. Now, this shift between a kingly state, a dynastic state, to a territorial state is that a king. Because remember, what is the big problem? This is one of the big problems about kingship and kingship territories. Kingship. It is the problem of a ruler, a king rules a people, a territory or a land. It's his land. It's patrimonial in this sense. But what do I mean by patrimonial? It's his property. It's his. Therefore, to understand the connection of land to personhood, there's this idea in medieval Christianity, and this is a leftover. This leftover of medieval Christianity that survives even ironically, it survives in England and America more than, and less so in England because, after Brexit, before Brexit, when the second the British entered the EU, they ceased being British. They lost their Britishness. And therefore, the only thing that survived of Britain was America. And a little bit of Australia. No, remember, a little bit of Australia is basically the criminals. The Anglo-Saxon culture, the British culture of its institutionals and legal form was transformed to America, but it was adapted to a differential situation. So it's not purely England, but it's England modified to a multi-jurisdictional system.
What about New Zealand?
What?
New Zealand.
Well, New Zealand is just that's later. That's post. It's Victorian again. Victorian England. Victorian England it's more influenced by Indian culture and things Indian and imperial than in other words, it's much later. It's basically mid 19th century colonization that is completely different than. Most of the American establishment was built during the Stuarts. Okay, it's Tudor England. It's a post-Tudor culture of England. Therefore, it has those institutional structures, and it's political culture. That's why that book Albion Seed is a very good book to understand that. To understand America is to understand that it's English political culture that shaped it. So what is his transition from territorial state to this? Well, he says these six institutional structures identified the kingly state to transition. Standing armies, centralized bureaucracies, regular taxation, a diplomatic representation. In other words, they have controlled diplomacy. Kings control, and there's diplomacies controlled by the monarchy. And last, economic policies, and last but not least, the sixth criteria, the king as the head of state. Sorry, even in the Catholic realm. Trust me, Ferdinand of Spain was controlling who was made bishop, archbishop. Even before rise of Protestant Christianity, the English crown very much controlled who was going to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, New York. The Reformation only radicalizes it, gives it more explicit control. The Protestant states, they seize, the crown totally seizes. And by the way, by seizing the church, what do you get? When you seize the church, take over the church, what do you get?
You can influence.
No, more than that. What does the church have?
Create new church.
Nope.
Money.
The king now gets a whole bunch of money that the kings had to always beg money from their lords. Now they just basically killed off basically the largest landholders, their capital, their land, and what they can do, they can appoint new leaders to them that own their authority. Okay, the English crown was interesting. The English crown centralized all power, and in other words, all the lords owed their title to the English crown, 1066 Norman Conquest. On the continent, that was not the case. Most of the aristocrats had their titles previously between any monarch, and therefore held their title independent of the king that they shared loyalty to. In other words, the European kings were weak. The English crown made his aristocracy and could unmake it at will. So therefore, the English had English political development was basically 400 years ahead of the continent because of the conquest. England had a centralized monarchy, even a territorial state technically, maybe even verging on a state nation at the time of, even before the reign of Tudors. The Tudors basically modify it. Now, head of it is. This is this territorial state moment is the king as the real former head of church. Now, in chapter 8 of that reading, we're looking at chapter 6, 7, and 8 of the brief history of the modern state and its constitutional orders, the Bobbitt reading in the thing. He goes on page 64 for a pithy paragraph stating the difference between the state nation and the state nation, where the nation acts on behalf of the state, and the nation state, where the state exists to further the interest of the nation. That's the big difference. The state nation is that the state controls the nation. The example of this would be, question or you're stretching your arm? Louis the 14th. Remember what Louis XIV said? Le state le moi. I am the state. The king is the state. The king is the state. The state what is acting on the nation acts on behalf of the state. The state, the king, the state utilizes the nation for its power. Ferdinand of Spain, Ferdinand of Spain unifies Spain and puts all things under the Castilian crown, right? He merges with Aragon. He's from Aragon. He merges with Castile. He then also marries into the Castilian crown, but does what? It merges Portugal and Spain and all of Spain in control. He exterminates the Muslims of what is that famous, the famous city that was Spanish, the Muslim city in Spain. It expels them and unifies all of that, conquers most of North Africa, Tunisian area control, becomes a major player in the affairs of the Italian peninsula, unifies Navarra, seeks to control. His ancestor, through the marriage with the Habsburg, creates the Habsburg dynasty, the Spanish Habsburgs, which then become the Austrian Habsburgs, and then ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, right? So if you understand the nature of these claims, that if you look at the development of rulers and princes, yes?
So actually I think the Austrian Habsburgs were first.
No, they were first. He married into the family, then they dump the daughter, and then he takes over control. And he marries someone else, because the mistake of Isabella and Ferdinand was they were too close to each other. They didn't produce children that was healthy enough or survival enough, no male heir. And because they married into it Habsburg, thinking that the Habsburgs would be controlled, but no. Always make sure you have a male heir, unless you're Elizabeth. Unless you have a woman ruler who is as ruthless and as vicious. I mean, the two greatest women rulers. Come on, Elizabeth first of England, and who else?
Margaret Thatcher?
No. Catherine the Great. Catherine. She makes modern Russia. She unifies, basically conquered all of the rest of Ukraine and much of Poland into a Russian Empire, right? So therefore, this is the difference. Now, the nation state is what happens here. The nation takes control of the state. The people take control of the state. Example of this is the French Revolution, where the people take over, they kill the king. The state form, the crown. The king is removed, but the state survives under the control of the people. National sovereignty, popular sovereignty. The people are the sovereign. This is the idea. The Volk stand up stund. The Volk, das Reich. Much of you understand the people. Who is the people? Their will creates the nation, the state. So therefore, this is that aspect of it. Now, here's the thing: the two metaphors. The state as network, right? And the state depends on society. The state acts as a network, conveying decisions made by responsible parties, so that both the medium of constitutional change and strategic change and also the expression of constitutional strategic change. So it's a network of change, right? The state is a network system. That's one metaphor. The other metaphor is that state depends on society. In other words, they're Siamese twins, right? The state is in a way, a virus depends on the nuclei material of the cell, so that it is both made in time. It has a birth and a life and decay, and made of time. That what we know of it is the narrative of this morphology. The story of the adaptation of the conditions of the society. So that for the state and the society are interconnected. Bobbitt argues that probably the state is a virus, he argues. I argue that this is his modification of it. I think he is following Montesquieu here rather than Hobbes, because Hobbes would argue the state and society is the same thing. They're Siamese entities. They're the same body, but they're unified, like two things connected at the same body. They're the same thing in that sense. The state that is the state both composes history and is composed of history. In other words, it's both the thing that is created by past actions, but it also creates history, the record of past actions, right? It is both acted on and actor. And that's why it is this double metaphor. Every error asks, what is the state supposed to be doing? Bobbitt argues. The answer to this question provides us with the indication of the grounds of the state's legitimacy. For we only know the purpose of the state when we can say whether it's succeeding. In other words, you can only know the purpose. In other words, we have to ask, what should the state be doing? Therefore, by saying that question, answering that question, we are defining its legitimization. And we decide whether, if it's doing it or not, accomplishing it, is whether it is what? Whether it's succeeding in doing what it wants. Now the problem here is this is a problem of limitations. We'll talk about this. In other words, you can't have the state do it. If you want the state to do everything, it will fail. So you have to have a reasonable expectations of things, because there's limits to what anything can do. So if you expect the state to do omnipotence, well, the problem is the logic of the state is its claim of omnipotence, God-like omnipotence. But the problem with that is, I hate to say it, nothing mortal can be omnipotent. It's the problem, as Schmidt rightly says, the concept of the state, the concept of sovereignty, is secularized theology. In other words, it's God secularized. Even Hobbes does this. What does he call the Leviathan? The Leviathan of the Commonwealth. This is what? A mortal God. A creature that is like a God that man creates. Man creates the state like man creates a mortal God who is omnipotent. This is the problem with this. The problem here is that can anything mortal or temporal be omnipotent? Probably not. And to insist on an omnipotence would lead to its failure. In other words, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. So there's no coincidence. He says it's no coincidence that the appearance of the nation state in the United States owing to the Civil War, and in Europe owing to the unification of Germany, was accompanied by a strategic style of total war. Total war. You know what total war is? I'm sorry, civilians are legitimate targets, because workers, you can't wage war without workers. You can't wage war without children being future soldiers. Democratic war is exterminative war. The Union Army won the Civil War by doing what? Burning the South. Slaughtering they broke every rule of traditional warfare. And the nation of modern warfare was mechanicistic modern warfare, the first modern war. In fact, the Civil War was. It prestaged the First World War, and why modern war is the way it is. So what is the purpose here? If the nation governed the state, the nation's welfare provided the state's reason for being. When the enemy nation must be destroyed, indeed, that was the way to destroy the state. How do you destroy the state? You destroy the state by destroying its people. Now, these 4 graphs, he has 4 plates here, 5 plates. This explains the evolutionary structure of wars and the peace that wars create, these great wars. Every time there's a state rivalry, states will have rivalry, right? One state, another state will have rivalries, and they want to seek domination and control. When one state has more power than the other state, it will seek domination, and what will happen is it'll be able to do it because of the innovations that it created. So therefore, you have the territorial mockers. We have what? The 30 wars, the epochal wars of each era. The Habsburg-Valois War, the 30-Year War, the Louis XIV's War, the Wars of the French Revolution, and the Long War. You know what the Long War is? 1914 to 1990. World War II and World War I was the same war. And the collapse of the Soviet Union Cold War was all one war. What began in Sarajevo ended in Sarajevo. Okay? In fact, the end of this period of the long war ended with the collapse of Yugoslavia and the return to the world that was the globalized world of the late 19th century. And this also explains this. My God, the international orders. Sorry, we got a minute. I just want to spend 1 minute before you go to show this graph. You can see the graph. Look at this is the military. At each type of thing, each state. This is the political. This is the historic, strategic, constitutional innovations, right? And here is the military institution development. And every one of these developments connects with a political intervention up there. And it's the interconnection of this that drives the structure of these things. Nuclear warfare is the ultimate democratic warfare. Mass bombings you hate to say it, this is how you win wars. If you don't wage war that way, you can't win wars. The unwillingness of the United States to basically wage democratic wars, and that means how do you deal with the problem? You flatten it. Afghanistan would have been easier to deal with if you just sent 10 nuclear weapons. No problem. Glass. No reason to have any soldiers die. That's the sad. This is what you have to understand about democratic concepts. Democratic concepts aren't going to be humane. And actually, we shouldn't. Those inhumane. What we think is humane, actually, ironically, humanity, things we do for humanity reasons, can ultimately be greatly inhumane. Like African slavery. Why was African slavery brought to the New World? For totally humane reasons. To prevent the continued enslaving of the Native American populations. Because the forced coercion of Native populations was exterminating them. So the church said, let's not exterminate them, let's bring Africans in. They're able to do it, let's bring them in. So what was done for humane reasons ultimately produces inhumanity. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. See you after Easter.